Lewis Hamilton is heading back to Mercedes. Stay until the end to find out why Ferrari chose to part ways with him and launch a disciplinary procedure against the driver. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Lewis Hamilton's unexpected return to Mercedes has detonated a tidal wave of emotion, speculation, and disbelief throughout the entire Formula One ecosystem. A decision so layered, so psychologically rich, and so emotionally complex that it feels less like a career move and more like the pivotal climax of a long, unpredictable saga that's still being written. For years, fans and critics alike believed they had seen every possible iteration of Lewis: the fearless rookie, the dominant champion, the wounded warrior, the outspoken activist, the relentless perfectionist. But this version of him, the one who chooses brutal truth over polished illusion, is perhaps the most human and raw of all. It's not just about returning to a familiar garage or rekindling old alliances. This is about reclaiming his own reflection in a sport that nearly turned him into someone he no longer recognized. Ferrari, with its velvet mythology and seductive grandeur, was supposed to be his golden farewell. Instead, it became his crucible, the arena in which he rediscovered the price of pretending. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. What the cameras captured was cinematic. Lewis donning the scarlet suit, embraced by throngs of loyal tifosi, posing under the prancing horse emblem, standing tall as if stepping into the shoes of racing gods. But no camera could capture what was unraveling beneath the surface. In the silence of the paddock after hours, in the undercurrent of engineer meetings, in the stiffness of communication lines that used to feel instinctive, he felt it. A subtle erosion. A persistent disconnect. He wasn't ignored, but he wasn't heard. He wasn't disrespected, but he wasn't truly seen. Every weekend became a dance of diplomacy. Every comment had to be measured. Every instinct had to be justified. There was no room for his unique rhythm, his emotional intelligence, his ability to mold a team through trust and empathy. Ferrari, as storied and majestic as it is, was an institution built on legacy and inertia. There was little elasticity in the walls. And Lewis, whose greatness has always come from his fluidity, his refusal to be boxed in, found himself slowly hardening, retreating into a version of himself that was muted and mechanical. He tried to adapt. He wanted to make it work. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine hope. Because no one walks into Ferrari without dreaming of leaving a chapter in the book of legends. He trained harder. He over-communicated. He worked double on the simulator. He pulled every lever available. But the results were never just about car performance. They were about chemistry, intuition, emotional alignment. And that was never fully there. It was like playing a symphony where every note is correct, but the music never touches the soul. At Mercedes, he didn't just drive. He led. He inspired. He challenged and was challenged. He shaped the identity of a team that was more than a machine. It was a mirror of his values, his discipline, his dreams. And as the months dragged on at Ferrari, with smiles on podiums and carefully crafted press statements, he felt more and more like an actor in someone else's movie. Whispers started to build in the background. Journalists speculated, insiders exchanged glances, and the paddock, always a theater of politics and intuition, began sensing that something wasn't quite right. But Lewis stayed composed. Professional. Graceful. No public complaints. No leaks from his camp. Just that subtle change in his tone. That glint in his eye that longtime fans knew all too well. The look of a man not broken but preparing. Preparing to choose something terrifyingly honest. Because walking away from Ferrari isn't just walking away from a team, it's walking away from a myth. A global stage. A script written in gold. But Hamilton has always written his own script. And this time, he chose to tear the pages, not because they weren't impressive, but because they weren't authentic. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Conversations with Mercedes didn't need sales pitches. They needed soul. They needed a shared glance between old comrades. Toto Wolff didn't need convincing, he only needed confirmation. Because he never closed the door. He never stopped believing that the bond forged between them was deeper than success. It was forged in adversity, in rebuilding seasons, in nights where everything seemed lost and yet they still stood shoulder to shoulder. The reunion wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about reuniting with an identity that felt endangered. About reigniting a connection that was never severed, only silenced. The moment the announcement dropped, the the world tilted. Fans cried out in disbelief. Some were thrilled. Some were confused. Some felt betrayed. But no one felt indifferent. Social media erupted. Former drivers chimed in. Analysts scrambled for theories. Sponsors recalibrated. Rivals swallowed hard. Because this wasn't a routine change. This was Hamilton, the most complex, introspective, emotionally intelligent figure in modern racing, declaring that comfort, image, and optics meant nothing if they came at the cost of soul. He didn't choose nostalgia. He chose renewal. He didn't pick ease. He picked friction, evolution, raw truth. And now, the dynamics of Formula One are realigned. The power balance has shifted. Drivers who once felt safe are suddenly under pressure. Engineers are re-evaluating their trajectories. Young talent is looking at the Mercedes seat not as an endpoint, but as an ecosystem of purpose. Because where Lewis goes, culture follows. His presence is a gravitational force, reshaping every corridor he walks through. And he's walking back into Brackley not as the same man who left. He's walking in sharper, heavier with knowledge, lighter with pretense, fiercer with boundaries, gentler with ego. He's seen the other side. He's felt the difference between being celebrated and being empowered. And now he's ready to demand the latter, not just for himself, but for the team that once helped him shape a dynasty. This move isn't about legacy. It's about integrity. It's about refusing to be a symbol and insisting on being a force. Lewis Hamilton's return to Mercedes is the kind of story that transcends sport. It's about self-awareness, about choosing to belong rather than to perform, about returning to the place that allowed him to rise not because of what he represented, but because of who he was. And the scariest part for the competition? He's not back to reminisce. He's back to rewrite the ending. On his terms. With his fire. With nothing left to prove, only everything to unleash. Each morning began with a lingering ache, a silent unrest he couldn't shake, not born from physical fatigue or age, but from something deeper, something quieter and far more corrosive. Lewis Hamilton would wake in Maranello, look out at the crisp Italian morning, and feel the chill of detachment, not from the weather, but from the very heartbeat of the institution he had once dreamed could be his final frontier. There were no dramatic clashes, no overt betrayals, no screaming fallouts. Instead, there was something worse: silence. A silence that crept into meetings, wrapped around briefings, and lingered in the corners of every garage interaction. It was a silence that spoke of exclusion, not by rejection, but by irrelevance. He was there. Physically. Fully engaged. But he was not felt. Not in the way he had once been at Brackley. Not in the way he needed to be if he was to give everything of himself again. Frédéric Vasseur, the man tasked with leading Ferrari's resurrection, was not incompetent. Quite the opposite. He was calculated, precise, academically brilliant in strategy, a man of numbers and logic. But he was also distant, emotionally sterile in a way that contrasted sharply with the leadership Hamilton had once thrived under. Toto Wolff hadn't just been a boss. He had been a mirror, a brother, a partner in vision and war. With Toto, every strategy meeting pulsed with a sense of mutual risk. Every win was shared not just in celebration, but in conviction. At Ferrari with Vasseur, Hamilton often left meetings with more questions than clarity, with the uncomfortable sense that while his words were registered, they rarely penetrated deep enough to inspire action. It wasn't animosity, it was absence. The absence of emotional chemistry. The absence of shared rhythm. The absence of soul. The lack of connection became more apparent with each passing race weekend. The decisions made around him, pit windows, tire strategies, qualifying run plans, seemed logical on paper but always lacked the nuance of trust, the subtle fingerprint of collaboration that had once defined his time at Mercedes. What hurt more than the decisions themselves was the pattern, repeated scenarios where he found himself on the wrong end of a split call. A strategy gamble that favored his teammate. A software update that adapted better to someone else's style. An aerodynamic tweak that leaned into feedback that wasn't his. These weren't mistakes. These were choices. Choices that made it painfully clear who the team truly revolved around. Charles Leclerc was the golden child of Ferrari, the heir to its legacy, the local hero shaped within the very fabric of the Scuderia's DNA. And Lewis, despite his accolades, his 7 world titles, his endless nights of pushing machines past their limits, was always an addition, not a foundation. The team said all the right things: equal drivers, shared development, both have our full support. But reality whispered otherwise. The way engineers lingered longer at Charles's side. The way the media painted him as the soul of Ferrari's future. The way even subtle data collection protocols prioritized his preferences during simulations. It was all there, not in grand gestures, but in the invisible accumulation of marginal bias. And while Hamilton never demanded to be number one, he needed to be valued as an equal. What he got instead was ceremonial reverence and operational distance. He tried to bridge the divide. He initiated deeper feedback loops, open channels of communication, stayed late to connect with departments others ignored. He spoke of culture, of unity, of emotional investment as a competitive advantage. But Ferrari, for all its legendary heritage, moved slowly when it came to change. The system he had entered was centuries old in spirit, guarded, ceremonial, bound by tradition more than transformation. He didn't just need the car to change, he needed the people behind it to want to change with him. And that was the wall he couldn't climb. Not because he lacked influence, but because influence means little in a house where the blueprint was drawn long before you arrived. He noticed it in the way engineers responded to his insights. Technical conversations turned into procedural reports. Creative solutions were met with skepticism, as though his style of driving, his preferences, his championship-proven instincts were inconvenient variables in an already set plan. He felt himself become less of a co-architect and more of a data source. Useful, yes, but not pivotal. He would exit the cockpit, debrief with clarity, speak of how the rear needed more bite under acceleration, how the downforce balance destabilized the car in Sector 2. And the responses came not in passion, but in PowerPoints. Not in adjustments, but in agenda items for future evaluation. It was efficient. It was intelligent. It was cold. The isolation wasn't loud, it was surgical. He'd sit in the motorhome after practice, headphones in, staring at telemetry data, watching sectors green and purple across the screen, and yet feel no pulse. No charge. The car moved under him, but not with him. It responded to commands, but not to emotion. It went fast, but it didn't belong to him. He wasn't building it, he was renting it. Each corner, each lap, each radio call felt like a transaction. And when you've known the feeling of fighting alongside engineers who celebrated every millisecond gain like a shared miracle, that transactional dynamic eats away at your soul. Even on the good weekends, there was a hollowness to the triumphs. A podium finish that once felt like a triumph now felt like an obligation fulfilled. A clean qualifying lap that put him ahead of the pack was met with applause, not euphoria. He would cross the finish line, climb out of the cockpit, smile for the cameras, say the right things. But behind the mirrored visor and rehearsed media lines, the fire dimmed. Not for racing, but for this race. For this version of competition that had become about politics masked as professionalism, optics disguised as ambition, stability paraded as success. And all the while, the narrative outside kept shifting. Whispers in the paddock grew into carefully constructed rumors. He's lost the edge. He can't adapt to the Ferrari way. He expected to be worshipped. They didn't see the hours he spent mentoring junior engineers, or the nights reviewing data long after the garage closed. They didn't hear the countless meetings he pushed for, the cultural shifts he gently tried to ignite, the empathy he brought into a structure that viewed vulnerability as weakness. They painted him as distant, when he had never been more open. They labeled him demanding, when all he had ever asked for was shared accountability. The deeper truth, the one no one wanted to speak aloud, was that Lewis Hamilton had not failed at Ferrari. Ferrari had failed to receive him. Not because they didn't want success, but because they wanted it their way, with their system, their heroes, their comfort zones intact. And Hamilton, by his very nature, challenged that comfort. He wasn't just a driver, he was a disruptor of norms, a recalibrator of culture. And where some saw that as an asset, others saw it as a threat. He didn't storm out. He didn't light fires. He kept his dignity intact, because that was the only thing he still had complete control over. But as he looked out from the podium that final time, red suit zipped up to the collar, trophy in hand, the weight of history behind him, he felt no joy. Just clarity. A quiet, unshakable understanding that he could no longer afford to shrink himself to fit a legacy that didn't make room for his own. Because Lewis Hamilton isn't a chapter in someone else's story. He's the author of his own. And somewhere else, The pen was waiting. The quiet inside him wasn't peace. It was suffocation disguised as stillness. Every circuit he completed in the red car felt like a confession, a silent admittance that something somewhere had gone irreparably off track. The engine screamed, the tires gripped, the team moved like clockwork, but none of it reached him. The heartbeat that had once pulsed in sync with the roar of the machinery was now irregular, subdued, searching for meaning in echoes that no longer responded. It wasn't that he had stopped caring. On the contrary, he cared too deeply. But care without connection is torment. He trained harder. He spent longer hours in the gym, pushing his body to new limits. He lived like a monk, disciplined, focused, isolated. Yet the smile that used to appear naturally had become an act, a costume worn to keep the illusion intact. The media saw a composed man. The fans saw a champion. But inside, there was a silence, heavy and unyielding, filled with questions no one dared ask out loud. He started to drift, not outwardly, not in performance, but inwardly, spiritually. The Ferrari dream had always been painted in gold, glory, legacy, the final brushstroke on a legendary canvas. But what he encountered was something altogether different. Expectations had become chains. The culture, though rich in history, felt rigid, inflexible. There was admiration, yes. Respect, certainly. But no intimacy. No true understanding. They knew Lewis Hamilton the icon, but not Lewis the individual. He wasn't a partner, he was a project. A symbol of ambition, of narrative, not of unity. And that realization began to eat away at him. Slowly, relentlessly. In meetings, he spoke less. In interviews, he defaulted to polished phrases. His fire hadn't gone out. It had been smothered by silence, by detachment, by the weight of wearing a suit tailored for someone he no longer recognized. He lay awake at night, staring at ceilings in hotel rooms that all looked the same. The bed sheets were crisp, the decor luxurious, but none of it felt like home. His mind raced with doubts he couldn't silence. What if the magic had been tied not to the machine, but to the environment? What if he hadn't just left a team, but had walked away from a family, a sanctuary where he was truly seen? Was the roar of the Tifosi enough to replace the invisible thread that had connected him to something greater at Mercedes? He didn't regret chasing the dream, but he feared what the pursuit had cost. Maybe greatness wasn't about changing scenery. Maybe it was about protecting the soil where your roots had grown deepest. The phone rang at a moment when he wasn't expecting anything. A familiar name flashed on the screen. Not from a PR manager. Not from a racing director. From someone who had once been the closest thing to a brother in the cutthroat world of motorsport. Toto Wolff. There was no introduction, no agenda, no preamble. Just one question, simple, disarming, and devastating. Are you still happy? That sentence echoed like thunder in a canyon. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't calculated. It was personal. And it hit him with more force than any collision on track ever could. For several seconds, he said nothing. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the honesty required to speak it aloud would have shattered the fragile image he'd been upholding. That silence between them, long, dense, full of everything unspoken, was the spark. Not a deal. Not a proposal. Just the reawakening of something ancient and true, trust. What followed wasn't a parade of meetings in corporate boardrooms or confidential phone calls with lawyers and agents. It was quieter. More sacred. They met in private spaces, living rooms, balconies overlooking the city at dusk, kitchens where wine replaced water and walls absorbed confessions. No branding. No headlines. No pressure. Just conversations between two men whose legacies were forever intertwined. They reminisced. They laughed. They cried. They spoke of wounds unhealed and triumphs unforgotten. And through every word, every pause, Toto didn't try to convince, he simply reminded. He reminded Lewis of who he had been, not the record breaker, not the 7-time world champion, but the warrior who raced with soul. He reminded him of those evenings after qualifying when they would sit side by side, exhausted and exhilarated, knowing they had just rewritten history once again. He reminded him of moments when the world doubted them and they responded not with words, but with performance. He reminded him that Mercedes had never been perfect, but it had always been real. And in that reality, there had been a heartbeat that only Hamilton could amplify. Toto didn't bring spreadsheets. He brought stories. He didn't promise podiums. He promised honesty. He didn't speak of strategies. He spoke of legacy. And slowly, something began to shift in Lewis. The man who had once feared that his best days were behind him started to feel the possibility of something even more powerful: completion. Not as a swan song. Not as a farewell tour. But as a resurrection. A return to the arena, not to prove the world wrong, but to prove himself right. There was no press release. No cryptic social media teaser. Because this wasn't marketing. This was metamorphosis. He trained with a different rhythm now, not just faster but freer. He walked into meetings with an energy that turned heads again. Engineers noticed. Young drivers watched closely. The whispers returned, growing louder each week. Could it be? Was Lewis coming back home? But those who knew really knew, understood. It wasn't about a comeback. It was about reconnection, reignition, redemption. Because legacy doesn't rest. It evolves. And Lewis wasn't done creating. He wasn't ready to be frozen in time, to become a museum piece for future champions to admire. He still had poetry to write in speed, still had battles to fight with precision, still had a voice to raise, not just for himself, but for every soul who had ever dared to believe they could rise from silence and reclaim their song. Toto had offered him no guarantees, only a mirror. And in that reflection, Lewis saw not just a driver, but a man who had been to the top, tasted emptiness, and chosen to climb again, not because he had to, but because the story demanded a better ending. The helmet went back on. The visor lowered. The world watched. Not because they expected the past, but because they sensed the future. And this time, it wasn't about proving he was still the best. It was about reminding everyone why he ever was. The negotiation that took place between Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes was nothing resembling the transactional, cold, calculated affairs that typically define high-stakes motorsport contracts. This wasn't about timing clauses, championship bonuses, or sponsorship leverage. It wasn't about winning power plays behind closed doors or securing the most lucrative deal on the grid. No agents threw ultimatums. No threats loomed in the background. There were no secret meetings under cover of night in Monaco or coded PR statements designed to manipulate headlines. Instead, what unfolded was something radically different. Unfiltered, human, honest. When Hamilton sat down with the leadership at Mercedes, he didn't ask for the world. He didn't ask for more zeros on a paycheck or ironclad guarantees. He asked for something intangible, something that couldn't be measured in spreadsheets or lap times. He asked for purpose. He asked for impact. He asked for the ability to matter in ways that went far beyond driving the car on Sunday afternoons. Mercedes didn't respond with a traditional offer. What they gave him was a vision. Not a role, not a position, but a space within the soul of the team. They offered him more than access. They offered him influence. Authority. A chance to be embedded in the core of what the Silver Arrows were becoming. Hamilton wouldn't merely sit in debriefs. He would shape the very questions being asked. He wouldn't just give feedback on a car's behavior. He'd be involved in the architecture of its design. He would be at the center of discussions around tire behavior, fuel management systems, and suspension dynamics. The aerodynamics department would consult him directly. Simulator engineers would calibrate algorithms based on his insights. The team was no longer offering a seat, they were offering a stake. A legacy. A future. And Hamilton, looking into the eyes of the people who had watched him grow, who had fought alongside him through glory and hardship, said yes. But he didn't say yes because of technical control or corporate power. He accepted because what was being offered resonated with something much deeper, a longing to return to a place where he wasn't just heard, but understood. Where he wasn't just utilized, but embraced. He wasn't coming back for a title. He was coming home. When word escaped into the wild, the global reaction didn't trickle, it surged. Every corner of the motorsport universe reacted with a ferocity that felt almost cinematic. The whispers became waves. The speculation turned into obsession. Media outlets lost their composure. Press rooms buzzed like hornets' nests. Analysts canceled vacations. Social media platforms buckled under the weight of excitement. Every timeline was flooded. Memes, predictions, debates, tears. The shockwaves didn't just reach fans. They pierced through teams, manufacturers, sponsors. Everyone was jolted. Because this wasn't just a personnel move. It was a shift in the emotional gravity of the sport. Hamilton wasn't rumored to return. He was returning. And nothing about that fact felt ordinary. At Ferrari, the reaction was layered. On the surface, elegance prevailed. They issued a statement crafted with diplomacy and poise, gratitude, recognition, professionalism. They applauded his character. They acknowledged his contribution. They wrapped the ending in ribbons. But behind the velvet curtain, the tone was completely different. The silence inside the factory in Maranello was deafening. Engineers sat in stunned disbelief. Strategists avoided eye contact. A tension hung in the air that no motivational speech could erase. What they lost wasn't just a driver. It was the energy he carried, the unwavering confidence he exuded even when things fell apart. He brought an aura, an atmosphere, a belief that any race could be won, that every challenge had a solution. That kind of presence doesn't leave quietly. It leaves echoes. And those echoes rang out through every corridor of that crimson fortress. Meanwhile, at Mercedes, the atmosphere underwent a transformation that felt almost supernatural. The energy shifted. The colors looked brighter. Conversations returned to whiteboards and break rooms with a new rhythm. Engineers found their creativity reignited. Designers pushed boundaries they'd abandoned during the dark winters of mediocrity. Mechanics felt the pulse return to their work. What had once been routine was now urgent. What had been weighed down by expectation was now lifted by inspiration. Because Hamilton wasn't just rejoining them, he was reigniting them. His presence brought more than technical insight. It brought a feeling. A conviction that this next chapter wouldn't be just about wins. It would be about evolution. Hamilton didn't speak about revenge or validation. He spoke about progress. About collaboration. About helping craft a machine that wasn't just fast, but representative of something meaningful. He wanted to empower the next generation, engineers, drivers, thinkers. He wanted to influence not just the machinery, but the mentality. He viewed the team as a living organism, and his role wasn't just to pilot it, but to nurture it. He walked through the hallways like a bridge between past and future. And everyone followed, not because of obligation, but because they believed. He no longer moved like someone chasing ghosts or defending a throne. He moved like someone building a cathedral. Every conversation, every note, every interaction carried weight. His presence alone made people aim higher, dream harder, focus deeper. He spoke of strategy as art, of teamwork as chemistry, of setbacks as lessons waiting to be turned into breakthroughs. He didn't walk in as the 7-time world champion. He walked in as a compass. And the car, his car, wasn't just being prepared for another season. It was being transformed into a vessel for a new era. Every component, every test, every tweak now existed in the context of something much larger. The goal wasn't simply pole positions or podiums. It was culture, identity, a future that extended far beyond checkered flags. And every person in that factory, from data analysts to carbon fiber technicians, understood that. This version of Hamilton wasn't about rewriting history. It was about redefining what matters in a sport that often forgets its heart. He returned not to recapture the past, but to invest in the present, to contribute to something wider, deeper, more profound. He wasn't just back. He was anchored, embedded, awake in a way that few athletes ever truly are. And as he prepared to step back into the cockpit, as he tightened the belts and lowered the visor, there wasn't just anticipation. There was reverence. Because this wasn't just a comeback. It wasn't a farewell tour. It was a reawakening. The sound of that engine firing wasn't noise. It was poetry. It was signal. A message to the sport that Lewis Hamilton was not a memory, not a relic, not a former great returning for one last dance. He was something far more dangerous. He was clarity in human form. A man with nothing left to prove, but everything left to give. A soul not chasing victory, but giving it away to those who believed in him. And the world watched, not because of nostalgia, but because they sensed it too. This wasn't the continuation of a story. This was a rebirth. And the truth, raw, unfiltered, unstoppable, was finally alive again on 4 wheels.